Welcome you all, everyone. I am Ghosh. I am an assistant professor in the Department of English, Krishna Chandra College, Hetampur, Birbhum. And today, we will try to look into the history of English language, which is in your discipline-specific elective 4 paper in your semester 6 syllabus. Language is our primary source of communication. It's the method through which we share our ideas and thoughts with others. There are thousands of languages in this world. Countries have their own national languages in addition to a variety of local languages spoken and understood by their people in different regions. Some languages are spoken by millions of people, others by only a few thousand. Through this short documentary, we will try to understand the history of English language. But firstly, let us understand that language is a fundamental human faculty, and it is basically used for communication, creative expression, face-to-face communication, scientific inquiry, expression of literature, art, etc. And there are almost 6,000 to 7,000 languages in the world, and some of the notable languages are Spanish, Chinese Mandarin, Hindi, English, Bengali, French, German, Arabic, and thousands of others. Talking about the history of the English language, certain migrations, occupations, settlements, and invasions become very much important. For example, Celtic migrations of 1000 before Christ, Roman occupation around 43 to 400 AD, Germanic settlements from 400s, Viking invasions from around 7th to 8th to 9th centuries, Norman invasions of 1066 leading to Norman Conquest, and of course the influence of Renaissance and the imperial growth of England as a very powerful nation. These all contributed greatly to the making of the English language today. Talking about the history of the English language, certain migrations, occupations, settlements, and invasions become very much important. For example, Celtic migrations of 1000 before Christ, Roman occupation around 43 to 400 AD, Germanic settlements from 400s, Viking invasions from around 7th to 8th to 9th centuries, Norman invasions of 1066 leading to Norman Conquest, and of course the influence of Renaissance and the imperial growth of England as a very powerful nation. These all contributed greatly to the making of the English language today. The English language of today reflects many centuries of development. The political and social events that have in the course of English history so profoundly affected the English people in their national life have generally had a recognizable effect on their language. The Roman Christianizing of Britain in 597 brought England into contact with Latin civilization and made significant additions to our vocabulary. The Scandinavian invasions resulted in a considerable mixture of the two peoples and their languages. The Norman Conquest made English for 2 centuries the language mainly of the lower classes, while the nobles and those associated with them used French on almost all occasions. And when English once more regained supremacy as the language of all elements of the population, it was an English greatly changed in both form and vocabulary from what it had been in 1066. In a similar way, the 100 Years' War, the rise of an important middle class, the Renaissance, the development of England as a maritime power, the expansion of the British Empire, and the growth of commerce and industry, of science and literature have each in their way contributed to the development of the language. References in scholarly and popular works to Indian English, Caribbean English, West African English, and other regional varieties point to the fact that the political and cultural history of the English language is not simply the history of the British Isles and of North America, but a truly international history of quite divergent societies, which have caused the language to change and become enriched as it responds to their own special needs. The English language belongs to the Teutonic branch of the Indo-European family of tongues. Indo-European is the name given to a set of linguistic forms from which nearly all European languages, as well as those of Persia and a very large part of India, can be shown to have descended. The Indo-European family of languages was also called the Indo-Germanic and still earlier Aryan. It was called Indo-Germanic because of the predominance and pioneering position of the German philologists of the 19th century who first made an elaborate comparative study of these languages. Aryan is also the name given earlier by the fairer-skinned bringers of the Hindu civilization to India from the north in order to distinguish themselves from the darker and the less cultured peoples from whom they largely conquered. By a family of languages is meant a group bound together by unmistakable likeness in words and grammatical forms. A branch indicates a smaller group which has, besides the characteristics of the larger division, a certain similarity in words and forms not known to other members of the family. This similarity within the group is accounted for by original union of all members of the family within a limited area. In other words, by a common home and a common ancestry. The differences between two members of the same family or group are the result of gradual separation from one another, emphasized probably by some natural boundary as a river or a mountain range. This particular diagram clearly shows the 9 main branches of the Indo-European family of languages. The diagram shows only lines of descent. There are many interrelations due to borrowing among branches and sub-branches of the sub-families of languages, which could be shown by crisscrossing lateral or horizontal lines. Through this diagram, we can clearly see that how many languages have influenced the English language of today. Through this diagram, we can detect that 5% of Greek, 7.5% of Latin, 40% of Anglo-Saxon words, 15% of Norse, 30% of French words, and 2.5% of other words from other languages have contributed to the making of the present English language. Sir William Jones and Jacob Grimm are the two people who for the first time talked about the Indo-European family of languages. Sir William Jones, a British judge stationed in India in 1780, for the first time discovers that Sanskrit bears a striking resemblance to Latin and Greek. And Jacob Grimm, one of the famous Grimm brothers, established that the German water and English father has the same root as the Sanskrit Latin river and ratter. So, words such as me, new, seven, and mother were also found to share common ancestry. So, Indo-European becomes for the first time the common source of language. English, like all other languages, is subject to that constant growth and decay that characterize all forms of life. It is a convenient figure of speech to speak of languages as living and dead, although we rarely think of language as something that possesses life apart from the people who speak it. as we can think of plants and of animals. We can observe in speech something like the process of change that characterizes the life of living things. When a language ceases to change, we call it a dead language. For example, classical Latin is a dead language because it has not changed for nearly 2000 years. Sanskrit, similarly, is a dead language. The change that is constantly going on in a living language can be most easily seen in the vocabulary. Old words die out, new words are added, and existing words change their meaning. For example, nice in Shakespeare's day meant foolish. Rheumatism signified a cold in the head. Less familiar, but no less real, is the change of pronunciation, a slow but steady alternation, especially in the vowel sounds, had characterized English throughout its history. Old English stan has become our stone, coo has become cow. So, thus, it is a part of the task of the linguist to trace the influences that are constantly at work, tending to alter the language from age to age as spoken and written, and that have brought about such an extensive alteration in English as to make English language of, for example, 1000 AD quite unintelligible to English speakers of 2020. It is quite clear, however, that the language of a powerful nation will acquire importance as a direct reflection of political, economic, technological, and military strength. So also will the arts and sciences expressed in that language have advantages, including the opportunities for propagation. The spread of arts and sciences through the medium of a particular language in turn reinforces the prestige of that language. Internal deficits such as an inadequate vocabulary for the requirements at hand need not restrict the spread of language. It is perfectly normal for a language to acquire through various means, including borrowing from other languages, the words that it needs. Thus, any language among 4,000 languages across the world could have attained the position of importance that the half dozen or so most widely spoken languages have attained if the external conditions had been right. English, French, German, and Spanish are important languages because of the history and influence of their populations in modern times. For this reason, they are widely studied outside the country of their use. Sometimes the cultural importance of a nation has at some former time been so great that its language remains important long after it has ceased to represent political, commercial, and other greatness. Greek, for example, is studied in its classical form because of the great civilization preserved and recorded in its literature. But in its modern form, as spoken in Greece today, the language Greek does not serve as a language of wider communication. English is the largest language by number of speakers and the third most spoken native language in the world after the standard Chinese Mandarin and Spanish. It is the most widely learned second language and is either the official language or one of the official languages in almost 60 sovereign states. There are more people who have learned it as a second language than there are native speakers. It is estimated that there are over 1.3 billion speakers of English across the world. English is the majority native language in the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Republic of Ireland, and it is widely spoken in some areas of the Caribbean, Africa, and South Asia. English, however, is not the most widely used native language in the world. Chinese, in its 8 spoken varieties, is known to 1.3 billion people in China alone. Spanish, next in size to English, is spoken by almost 330 million people, Portuguese by 180 million, Russian by 175 million, German by 110 million, French by 80 million native speakers, and a large number of second language speakers, and Italian by 65 million. A language may be important as a lingua franca in a country or region whose diverse populations would otherwise be unable to communicate. This is especially true in the former colonies of England and France, whose colonial languages have remained indispensable even after independence, and often in spite of outright hostility to the political and cultural values that the European languages represent. Now let us sum up the entire history of English language in brief. The formation of English from Indo-European is the story of basically three major invasions and a cultural revolution. In the simplest terms, the language was brought to Britain by Germanic tribes, the Angles, Saxons and Jutes, influenced vigorously by Latin and Greek when St. Augustine and his followers converted England to Christianity in 597 AD, subtly enriched by the Danes and the Scandinavians, and finally transformed by the French-speaking Normans. So, in general, we can divide the entire history of English language into various periods. The influence of the Celts, that is Britons and the Gales, up to 55 BC. Roman Conquest from 55 BC to 407 AD. Anglo-Saxon period from 407 AD to 787 or 800 AD. Then Viking invasions of the Scandinavians, that is Danes, Swedish people and others, from 787 AD to 1066 AD. And of course, the Norman Conquest of the Britain began in 1066 AD. As already mentioned, modern English belongs to the Germanic group of Indo-European languages. In the history of the making of English, some movements and events stand out. For example, 5th and 6th century migration of the three Germanic tribes, as I have already mentioned, Jutes, Saxon and Angles, to what is now known as England, Angles land, England. St. Augustine's arrival in 597 AD for the Christianization of the entire Britain is very important, and the conversion of the England to the Latin Christianity. In 8th and 9th and 10th century Scandinavian invasions, the Norman Conquest in the 11th century, the revival of learning in the 16th century known as the Renaissance, the settlement of the North America, Australia and South Africa by the English language people in the 19th century, and the political colonization of India and others in the same century. The name English means the speech of the Angli, the Angles, one of the three related tribes that settled in Britannia beginning in the 5th century. Then from the Jutland came the first tribe and settled in Kent and southern Hampshire. Saxons from Holstein next settled south of the Thames. The Angles from the Schleswig settled last north of the Thames. The Germanic name of the Angles was Angli, which became Engel in Old English. After 1000 AD, England was used to denote the Germanic peoples in Britain. The language was always known as English. The history of the English language really started with the arrival of these three Germanic tribes who invaded the Britain during this 5th century AD. Now these tribes, as I have already mentioned, the Angles, Saxon and the Jutes crossed the North Sea from what is today known as Denmark and northern Germany. At the time, the inhabitants of Britain spoke a Celtic language, but most of the Celtic speakers were pushed west and north by the invaders, mainly into what is now known as Wales, Scotland and Ireland. The Angles came from England and their language was called English, and from which the words England and English are derived. Here is a brief chronology of the English language. Around 43 AD, Roman invasion and occupation of the Britain began. Around 436 AD, Roman people withdraws themselves from the Britain. Around 449, settlement of Britain by Germanic invaders begins. Around 1066, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, invades and conquers England. 1066 is also known as the year of the Norman Conquest. It's a famous year. 1348, English replaces Latin as the languages of instruction in most schools. 1362, English replaces French as the language of law. English is used in Parliament for the first time in 1362. In 1388, Geoffrey Chaucer starts writing the Canterbury Tales. Around 1400, the great Babel shift begins. We will discuss what is it. In 1476, William Caxton establishes the first English printing press. In 1564, Shakespeare is born. Around 1607, the first permanent English settlement in the New World is established. In 1604, Teville Alphabetical, the first English dictionary, is published. 1616, the death of Shakespeare. 1623, Shakespeare's first folio, that is the complete works of Shakespeare, has been published. 1702, the first daily English language newspaper, the Daily Courant, is published in London. 1755, Dr. Samuel Johnson publishes his English dictionary. 1776, Thomas Jefferson writes the American Declaration of Independence. 1782, Britain abandons its colonies in what is later to become the USA. 1828, Webster publishes his American English Dictionary, now famously known as Webster's Dictionary. 1922, the British Broadcasting Corporation is founded, BBC. 1928, the Oxford English Dictionary is published for the first time. Now let us look into the key historical periods in English language. As I have already discussed, 450 to 1150 is known as the period of the Old English. 1150 to 1500 is known as the era of the Middle English. 1500 to 1700 is known as the early modern English. 1700 to 1900 is known as the period of the modern English, that is after the age of the Enlightenment. And from 1900 to the present, that is from the Victorian era down to the modernist and postmodernist period, is known as the late modern English. But who were there before the invasion of these Anglo-Saxon tribes and communities? Romans were there in England. They in fact created a great defensive fortification known as the Hadrian's Wall in the Roman province of the Britannia, began around in 122 AD in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It ran from the banks of the River Tyne near the North Sea to the Solway Firth on the Irish Sea. Now let us have a look into the important events during the Roman occupation. Julius Caesar begins the invasion and occupation of the Britain in 55 BC. Occupation completed by Claudius in 1st century AD, and Romans leave in 407 AD because the Visigoths attack the Rome. This leaves Britain defenseless. Saint Augustine, the other Augustine, lands in the Kent in 597 AD and for the first time converted England into the Latin Christianity. But there are some important results of the Roman occupation. First, it established camps that eventually became towns. They maintained relative peace. Latin heavily influenced the English language. That's the source of the influence of the Latin on the English language. And Christianity begins to replace the paganism, especially after St. Augustine converts the Ethelbert in 597. Now, who are the Germanic tribes who ruled England after the Roman Empire? They are Ostrogoths, Visigoths, Franks, Vandals, Angles, and Saxons. Now let us begin with the discussion of the Old English language. Generally, historians said that the existence of the Old English prevails from 450 AD to 1100 AD. And during this time, the 5th century, around the time of the 5th century AD, 3 Germanic tribes, as I have already mentioned, Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, came to the British Isles from various parts of the northwest Germany as well as Denmark. They spoke a mutually understandable language allied to the modern Frisian, the language of the northeastern region of the Netherlands, called as Old English. The arrival of St. Augustine in 597 and the introduction of Christianity into the Saxon England brought more Latin words into English language. For example, words like church, monk, and bishop. Celtic words are rare in modern English, although Celtic language do still remain. Welsh, Irish, Gaelic, and Cornish. These are the examples of the Celtic language. Celts had been invaded by the Romans, which brought Latin words into the language. Now, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity began around the late 6th century, which means a large amount of the texts that have been found in this time are religious. And the invasion of the Vikings, that is, the invasion of the Scandinavians, the Danes, the Swedish, and the other countries of the Denmark, they began to invade in the end of the 8th century. Their Old Norse language reassembled that of the Anglo-Saxon invaders, and much of its vocabulary was absorbed. Now let us introduce ourselves with the Anglo-Saxon people. Who the Anglo-Saxon people are. During 400s and 500s, Germanic tribes called Anglo-Saxons took over what used to be Roman colony of Britain. The country of England formed under a monarchy and held up to the attacks of the Vikings. And in 1066, a very important event occurred known as the Norman Conquest, where King Edward of England died without an heir, causing a power vacuum, a vacancy or weakness in the power structure of a country or region. And then the invasion of the Normans occurred. These are the Germanic tribes of Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, created by the imagination of the artist. And here are some of the Germanic races of the contemporary Britain: Anglo-Saxons, Normans, Norsemen, Gauls, Frisians, Franks, and Jutes. So, Old English language is basically a language of the Germanic invaders from Jutland and southern Denmark. As I have already mentioned, they are known as the Angles, Saxon, and the Jutes. Now let us begin our discussion of the Scandinavian influence upon the Old English language, generally known as the influence of the Vikings or also the Viking Age. We have to remember that this is the third foreign influence to the Old English language. The first is that of the Celts, the second is that of the Latin or Roman language, the third is that of the Scandinavians. In the 8th century, due to some economic and political provocation and changes, a spirit of unrest and adventurous enterprise emerges in the land of the Scandinavians, and they began a series of attacks upon all the land adjacent to the North Sea and the Baltic. The pinnacle of their achievement was reached in the beginning of the 11th century, and they are commonly known as the Vikings, and this particular age is also known as the Viking Age. Now, the Scandinavian influence not only affected the vocabulary, but also extended to morphology and syntax, although inflections are rarely transferred from one language to another. A certain number of inflectional suffixes in the Northumbrian dialect are attributed to the Scandinavian influence. And among these inflections are the use of the S of the third person singular, present indicative of the verbs, and the participial ending, and which is now replaced by the ing. The words scant, want, and athward written in the final T, the neuter adjective ending of the Old Norse. So, talking about the influence of the Old English, the majority of the words in the modern English come from the foreign, not Old English roots. Only about 1/6 of the known Old English words have descendants surviving today. But this influence of the Old English seems deceptive, because Old English is much more important than these statistics would indicate. About half of the most commonly used words in modern English have Old English roots. Words like be, water, and strong, for example, derive from the Old English roots. The majority of the words in the modern English come from foreign, not Old English roots. Only about 1/6 of the known Old English words have descendants surviving today. So, here are some of the words from the Old English. Pronouns like I, you, he, she, it, we, this, that, these, those. Nouns like friend, husband, anger, window, bull, cake, dirt, sun. Adjectives like happy, cold, black, bloody, tight, low. And verbs like can, shall, get, give, want, call. Conjunctions like as, and, but, so, then. And prepositions like up, down, in, on, to, by. Adverbs like while, when, where. These are the words that still we have written from the Old English language. And in the Old English language, the first epic in the English language, Beowulf, is also written. The Old English, whose best known surviving example is the poem Beowulf, lasted until about 1100, just after the most important event in the development and history of the English language, the Norman Conquest. And also, in the biblical, talking about the influence of the Bible, the Lord's Prayer in the Old English language reads like this. So this is an example of the Old English language. Now let us discuss about some of the key features of the Old English language. No single agreed system of spelling were there. Heavy use of the inflections, that is parts of the words, usually endings that indicate grammatical functions. There are certain muscular equality of the words like short, that they were direct and forceful. Grammatical, gender in nouns and adjectives. A writing system involved in runes as well as in the Roman alphabet. And use of the canings, as for example the bone house means body. These are some of the example of the canings. And flexible word order were also there. These are some of the key dates of the Old English period. 450, beginning of the Old English period. 1000, approximate date of the only surviving manuscript of Beowulf. 1066, Battle of the Hastings, Norman Conquest, which brought in French to the language, spoken by the most powerful people, and therefore it was used in political documents, administration and literature. French became the official language after 1066 AD, and 1150 Middle English periods begins. So, Middle English period from 1150 to 1500. Now we will talk about the impact of the Norman Conquest and the beginning of the Middle English period. In 1066, William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, which is part of the modern France, invaded and conquered England. The new conquerors, they were called the Normans or Northmen. They brought with them a kind of French which became the language of the royal court and the ruling class and the business classes. So French after 1066 became the official language. And for a period there was a kind of linguistic class division where the lower classes spoke English and the upper classes spoke French. This is really very important. And in the 14th century, English became dominant in Britain again, but with many French words added. And this language, this new English language, was completely a different language from the Old English language. Hence, this language is called Middle English. It was the language of the great poet Geoffrey Chaucer, but it would still be difficult for native English speakers to understand it today. Now, the new overlords who spoke a language of Old French known as Anglo-Norman. The Normans were two of Germanic stock, and Anglo-Norman was a French dialect that had significant Germanic influences in adding up to the basic Latin roots. Former to the Norman Conquest, Latin had been only a slight influence on the English language, chiefly through vestiges of the Roman occupation and from the adaptation of the Britain to Christianity in the 7th century. But now there was an extensive concoction of the Romance words, that is, Anglo-Norman words. So, the influence of 1066 Norman Conquest in the English language was very powerful and robust. The influence of the Normans can be exemplified by seeing at these two words. One word is beef and another is cow. Beef, usually eaten by the aristocracy, obtained from the Anglo-Norman, while the Anglo-Saxon commoners who tended the cattle kept the Germanic cow. And several legal languages such as jury, indict and verdict have Anglo-Norman roots because the Normans were running the courts. Now this split, where words commonly used by the aristocracy have Romantic roots and words frequently used by the Anglo-Saxon masses have Germanic roots, can be seen in various cases. Sometimes French words swap the Old English words. Uncle replaced yam and crime replaced Fiden. So components of the French and the Old English combine to form a new word. Other time, as the French gentle and the Germanic man, they created gentleman. So there were two dissimilar words with almost the same meaning carry on into the modern English. Thus, we have the French judgment and the Germanic doom or desire and wish, and they created the word called Judgment Day. It is helpful, or Doomsday. So it is helpful to compare different versions of a known text to see the differences between Old, Middle and Modern English. King John lost the province in 1204 of Normandy to the King of France, and this started a process where the Norman nobles of the England became gradually more separated from their French cousins. England became the principal concern of the nobility rather than estates in France, and as a result, the nobility adopted modified English as their native tongue. After 150 years, the Black Death of 1349-50 killed about 1/3 of the English population, and therefore, of this, the merchant and the laboring classes developed in social, economic, and with it English greater than before becomes an important language for the masses compared to the Anglo-Norman after the impact of the Black Death. So this combination of the two languages came to be known as the Middle English. The most well-known example of the Middle English is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So now let us discuss about the context of the Middle English period, the historical context specifically, and how this historical context contributed to a great extent to the making of the English language. So this particular period followed the Norman invasion, which brought a lot of French words into the English language. So historically, Norman Conquest is very important because it changed the structure of the English language. This is because William, the Duke of Normandy, crowned himself the King of England, but he only spoke French. And this meant English was considered as only suitable language for the lower class people. So French for the first time becomes the language, the official language of the upper class, the language of administration, the language of executive, and English becomes the language of the lower classes. It is only as a result of the Black Death, however, around 1350, there was a need for the working class laborers. And these people all spoke English, which led to a rise of the English language into the official domain. The printing press arrived near the end of the period, around 1476, from William Caxton. He printed all kinds of texts in the following 150 years. Around 20,000 books were printed. And this led to improved literacy rates and lowered the price of the books. Printers were able to choose which grammar and spellings to use, leading to a more standardized version of English language. So the standardization of the English language began with the advent of the printing press around 1476. And the accessibility of the texts led to an increased interest in literature. The society was very religious at the time, influencing attitudes, and also the texts were written at the same time. So there was a lack of the medical knowledge, so illness was a constant threat, An exploration of the New World brought new words from across the empire, including words like coffee, yogurt, kiosk, which is a Turkish word, and bizarre, chocolate, bhog. These words become very important. These were the French words. There are certain key features of the Middle English language. First, they are non-standardized version. Inconsistent spelling can be found in the Middle English period. Biblical sounding syntax and imagery, grammatical conversions, verbification, prefixation, suffixation, compounding. These are certain features of the Middle English period. The spelling of words resembles the literal pronunciation influenced by the Bible, which was meant to be a spoken text rather than a written text. Prepositional semantic shifts, lack of the do constructions for questions and negatives, and capitals used for the proper nouns but also for important common nouns. Emergence of colon for the first time began in the Middle English period, although they were not standardized. Colon and semicolon. Changing vowel sounds, the great vowel shift began in this particular period, which we will discuss later on. And French words entered the English vocabulary to a great extent in this Middle English period. More elegant and refined with softer sounds and different stresses on the endings of words. Loss of many inflections occurred during this period, and most importantly, context can be used to decipher the meaning of unfamiliar words in texts in this particular period. So linguistic context, which we will later call register, becomes a very important feature of the Middle English period. During this Middle English period, merging of the two languages, one English and another French, occurred. The influence of the Normans can be illustrated by looking at two words, beef and cow, as I have already said. Beef, commonly eaten by the aristocracy, derives from the Anglo-Norman, while the Anglo-Saxon commoners who tended the cattle retained the Germanic cow. Many legal terms such as indict, jury and verdict have Anglo-Norman roots because the Normans ran the courts. The split, where words commonly used by the aristocracy have Romantic roots and words frequently used by the Anglo-Saxon commoners have Germanic roots, can be seen clearly in many instances. Some of the key texts of this period are Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written around 1387 using the Romantic language, the language of the Romans, that is Latin and the French. The influence of this can clearly be seen in also other literary texts produced during this literary period. Gawain and the Green Knight and other medieval metrical romances can also be seen in this particular period. Some of the key dates of this particular period are 1171, when Henry II declares himself overlord of the Ireland, introducing the Norman, French and English to the country. And around this time, the University of Oxford is founded. 1476, a very important year when William Caxton's printing press arrives. 1500, when Henry VIII cuts the link between Rome and the Church of England, the beginning of Protestantism. Towards the end of Middle English period, a sudden and distinct change in the pronunciation started, with vowels being pronounced shorter and shorter. This is known as the Great Vowel Shift. It was a change in pronunciation that began around 1400 and separates the Middle English period from the modern English period. In linguistic terms, the shift was rather sudden, abrupt. The major changes occurring within a century. The shift is still not over. However, vowel sounds are still shortening, although the change has become considerably more gradual. So, from here we start the early modern English period from 1500 to 1700. The printing press established in the Middle English period, but which flourished in the Renaissance, meant spellings became more fixed and established and standardized. Science became a key factor in language change as more discoveries were made. Many words introduced through scientists were loan words which had been borrowed from other languages as people struggled to name their discoveries. Religion was still just as important in society as it had always been. During this period, the Protestant Reformation occurred, which also could have informed the language and attitudes to a great extent. Exploration and colonization also affected the use of language and made more words were picked up from various distant parts of the world. In short, the Renaissance, that is the rebirth of learning, led to a growth in interest in classical culture, contrasting to the intellectual sterility of the medieval times. Latin was still spoken and was influential of the English language, aided by the Renaissance. So, in the early modern English period, the Renaissance brought the revival of the classical scholarship and brought many classical Latin and Greek words into the language. These borrowings were deliberate, and many bemoaned the adoption of these inkhorn terms. But many terms survive even to this day. The influence of the printing press was a major factor in the development of the modern English, and it was completely shaped the language to a great extent. William Caxton brought the printing press to England in 1476, and books became more cheaper, literacy more common, publishing for the masses in the English became very profitable. So, the tremendous impact of the printing press on the standardization of the English language is a very important thing to discuss in the history of the language. In fact, the word standardization for the first time was invented due to this change. What is standardization? Standardization is a process which brought about by the printing press. The dialect of London, that is Cockney, where most publishing houses were located, became the standard. Spelling and grammar became fixed. The first English dictionary was published during this period in 1604. This early modern English period is also very important for Renaissance. The word Renaissance is Italian in origin, and it denotes revival or rebirth of learning in the European art, literature and philosophy after the dark ages of the medieval period, under the influence of classical models in the 14th and 16th centuries. Beginning in Italy and spreading to the rest of Europe by the 16th century, its influence was felt in literature, philosophy, art, culture, music, politics, science, religion, and other aspects of the intellectual inquiry. Renaissance scholars employed the humanist method in their study and researched for realism and human emotion in art. And William Shakespeare was a major game changer who born during this period of time, who changed the English language, the Elizabethan English language, in its lock, stock and barrel. So, Elizabethan English was much more in common with our language today than it does with the language of the Chaucer. And many familiar words and phrases were coined or first recorded by Shakespeare. Around some 2,000 words and countless idioms were created by Shakespeare himself. Newcomers to Shakespeare are often shocked at the number of the cliches contained in his plays until they realize that he coined them and they became cliches afterwards. For example, one fell swoop, vanish into thin air, and flesh and blood are all Shakespeare's own creations. Words he bequeathed to the language include critical, leapfrog, majestic, dwindle, and pedant. Shakespeare made a huge impact on the English language, leading to more romantic style of literature with French and Italian influences, which as well as creating his own words. He reduced inflections on endings of words, which led to the grammatical conversion, particularly making verbs from nouns, as for example, season your admiration, destruction shall dog them at their heels, I who at Philippi the great Brutus ghosted. At the same time, he also introduced idiomatic expressions into normal language, as for example, in my mind's eye, a tower of strength, be cruel only to be kind, love is blind. His use of hyphenated compounds also proved influential, often to form new words, as for example, fair play, ill-tuned, pell-mell. During this Renaissance period or early modern English period, another very important incident occurred, and that is the creation of the King James's Bible in 1611. King James appointed a panel of the university scholars to develop a single Bible translation for use across the country. They listened to the translations being read out aloud to assess rhythm and balance. It is intended as a spoken document. Unlike Shakespeare's language, the King James Bible reserves an archaic style. As for example, it keeps digged instead of dug and gat instead of got. Some of the key features of the early modern English can be discussed in this context now. The grammar reflected the transition between the Middle English and the contemporary English. The spelling and pronunciation started to become more standardized. Inconsistencies remained but gradually began to disappear. Shakespeare's work utilized unusual words. As I have already mentioned, some inflections such as est and eth were favored, while others completely rejected, and pronouns like thou, thee, thy were used in his work. The use of inflections was reduced, aided by Shakespeare's works. Phonology was influenced by the great vowel shift. This is where the pronunciation of long vowel sounds transformed to become similar to the pronunciation we have today. Latin and French influences on spelling still remained. V and U were interchangeable. Many prefixes, ante, post, pre and suffixes like et, ic, all were taken from Latin. Latin words are often lengthy and sound weighty and learned. Word order became more fixed. Subject, verb, object. Literature flourished due to the Renaissance, and the accessibility of the texts began. Shakespeare and the Bible's Book of the Common Prayer increased the normality of the idioms. There is evidence of class correlation with standard English, that is, higher class and better educated people speaking the standard language, and different tense usage also began during this period, as for example, glad we are got acquainted. So these are some of the key features of the early modern English. Now we begin the modern English period from 1700 to 1900. Let us discuss about the context, the historical and the social and the political context of the period. The Industrial Revolution influenced the English language as new ideas and contraptions were being invented, along with a range of new fields people could work in. English started to become an international language at this point. New varieties such as American English and Indian English began to form. The expansion of the British Empire in the 19th century and growing superpower status of the US in the 20th century also influenced the English language to a great extent, as evident in the Americanisms in everyday modern use. Cultural issues at this time included women's and children's rights. Religion also continued to play an important role in the society. Effects of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of the British Empire were two very important factors. Let us discuss some of the key features of the modern English period. Spelling became much more consistent and standardized. Regional differences in language lessened to a great extent. A leap in quality of education, literacy and communication meant English became much more standardized as a whole. Americanisms and American spellings, as for example or, our, and re and er endings started to form. Newly coined words were used more heavily and quickly. Use of auxiliary verbs became mandatory in the interrogative sentences, as for example, did he go running? Archaic possessive pronouns were still in use in earlier examples of texts, as for example, thy and thou. Dr. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, which marked the end of the modern English period around 1755, is very important in this context. Samuel Johnson published his dictionary in 1755. It was not the first dictionary, but was the most thorough and authoritative, giving advice on usage and different senses of the words as well as definitions. The dictionary provided clear, prescriptive, standard spellings, though this took several decades to filter through to everyday use. Now let us discuss about the key dates of this particular historical period. 1755, Johnson's dictionary is published. 1760 to 1820s, Industrial Revolution. 1800s, expansion of the British Empire brings other words into the English language as well as taking English words into others. 1828, Webster publishes his books on grammar, creating standards for grammar as well as spelling. Now let us discuss about the late modern English period beginning from 1900 to the present. Let us begin our discussion with the historical and social and political context of that period. Technology has become one of the main influences of the modern language as well as the pop culture. Celebrity obsessions, tabloids, gossip publications become very important during this period. Text speak such as lol and OMG, oh my god, laugh out loud, has filtered through into everyday usage, including the spoken language. The internet, texting, new gadgets, iPads and Kindles come with entirely new lexical sets as well as jargon and specialist language. Attitudes in society change. The importance of belief and religion has lessened. Attitudes towards females and sexuality are also slowly shifting. World wars, terrorism and environmental threats also impact the values and attitudes in society. English is now very much a global language with many influences and new words being created constantly. And regional differences in England have lessened, aided by the widespread education, standardization of language and the media, where the internet has increased accessibility to types of language. Now let us discuss about some of the key features of the late modern English language. First, the standardization of the spelling and grammar systems. Acronyms have become more normal part of the language, as for example, as I have said, OMG, LOL, FOMO, WTF. Grammar rules can be flouted more easily, as for example, experimenting with syntax and fronted conjunctions. The grammar can be used to suit the formality of the text. Slang and jargon is heavily used. In the written word, informality is much more common, especially in journalism, where fronted conjunctions and the use of the bullet points are normal, particularly in online news articles. Some of the key dates of this particular period: 1914 to 1918, the beginning of the First World War; 1922, BBC founded; 1928, Oxford English Dictionary is published for the first time; 1939 to 45, another ravaging World War, Second World War. 1961, Webster's third new international dictionary is published. 1988, the internet is released for the first time to the public. 1994, text messaging is introduced and the first modern blogs go online. 2006, Twitter is formed, leading to impulsive online expressions, first spreading news and a constant vent for users' thoughts. Around 2007 and 8, for the first time, Facebook started its journey and YouTube subsequently started its journey. So, some of the major influences on the modern language development and variation: the media, technology, social media and communication, traveling and migration, texting, jargon and slang, education, worldwide language. Today, sociolinguistics is a very prominent branch of the linguistics which investigates the individual and the social variation of language. It's a study of language in social contexts such as social groups and speech communications. It has to do with the interrelationships between language and the society. In this particular age, when English language has emerged itself as a global language, the importance of sociolinguistics, that is, the connection between society and the language and the social variation of language, becomes very important. At the same time, the borrowings of the new register and jargon into the language becomes also very important. Register is a contextual use of language, context-specific and profession-specific use of language and borrowing of the various professional terms into language, which becomes a very important feature of the English language. And jargon is actually a technical vocabulary associated with a special activity or group. As for example, the Snodgrass Muff leaders, Blops and Squeebs play by play. It's reference to the baseball. So these are some of the very important features that has actually been borrowed into the English language constantly. Let us now conclude this particular lecture. The revolution in communications during the 20th century has contributed to the spread of several European languages, but especially of English, because of major broadcasting and motion picture industries in the United States and Great Britain. It will be the combined effect of economic and cultural forces such as these, rather than explicit legislation by national or international bodies, that will determine the world languages of the future. One of the most obvious characteristics of the present English is the size and mixed character of its vocabulary. We have to remember that English is classified as a Germanic language. That is to say, it belongs to the group of languages to which German, Dutch, Flemish, Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian also belong. It shares with these languages similar grammatical structure and many common words. But on the other hand, more than half of its vocabulary is derived from Latin. Some of these borrowings have been direct, a great many through French, some through the other Romance languages. As a result, English also shares a great number of words with those languages of Europe that are derived from Latin, notably French, Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese. All of this means that English presents a somewhat familiar appearance to anyone who speaks either a Germanic or a Romance language. So, it actually makes English language almost a global language. In the course of the centuries of this practice, English has built up an unusual capacity for assimilating outside elements. We do not feel that there is anything foreign about the words chimpunk, hominy, moose, raccoon, and snark, all of which we have borrowed from the Native American. We are not conscious that the words brandy, cruller, landscape, measles, uproar, and wagon are from Dutch. And so with many other words in daily use, from Italian come balcony, canto, duet, granite, opera, piano, umbrella, volcano. From Spanish, alligator, cargo, contraband, cork, hammock, mosquito, sherry, stampede, tornado, vanilla. From Greek, directly or indirectly, acme, acrobat, anthology, barometer, catara, catastrophe, chronology, elastic, magic, tactics, tantalize, and a host of others. From Russian, stepi, vodka, rubble, troika, glasnost. And from Persian, caravan, dervish, divan, khaki, mogol, shal, sharbat. And ultimately, from Persian, jasmine, paradise, check, chase, lemon, lilac, turban, borax, and possibly spinac. A few minutes spent in the examination of any good etymological dictionary will show that English has borrowed from Hebrew and Arabic, Hungarian, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, Malay, Chinese, the languages of Java, Australia, Tahiti, Polynesia, West Africa, and from one of the aboriginal languages of Brazil, and it has assimilated these heterogeneous elements so successfully that only the professional student of language is aware of their origin. Studies of vocabulary acquisition is in second language learning support the impression that many students have had in studying a foreign language. Despite problems with folksamies, those words that have different meanings in two different languages, cognates generally are learned more rapidly and retained longer than words that are unrelated to words in the native language lexicon. The cosmopolitan vocabulary of English, with its cognates in many languages, is an undoubted asset. Let us conclude our lecture by showing the great historical timeline of the history of English language. The Roman Conquest began around 55 BC to 410 AD. The advent of the Angles, Saxons and Jutes invade. The Danish invasion, King Alfred the Great, Norman Conquest in 1066. Feudal England, the existence of the peasants, nobility and clergy, and then the 100 Years' War began in 1337, ending in 1453. War of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, Lancaster versus the York. Of course, the Reformation also occurs through the hands of the Henry VIII, which created the Church of England versus the Church of Rome, a great duet which later brought forth the Reformation movement in England, and then the Counter-Reformation movement through the hands of Queen Mary. The reign of the Queen Elizabeth from 1558 to 1603, defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, Renaissance, the rebirth of the letters, and of course, Caxton's printing press, 1475. These changed the landscape of the English language to a great extent. Thank you so much. See you in the next lecture. Till then, bye-bye.